So thanks everyone for coming this morning. I hope the workshops that you attended yesterday were productive as well and interesting. So we're here today to talk a little bit about migration profiles. So I'm aware that many people in this room probably have quite a lot of expertise in this area perhaps. So what I wanted to do just as sort of opening was to maybe ask everyone who has had an experience with migration profiles to maybe give a little bit of detail around if they've been involved in one or how much they've come into contact with these in the past. Thank you, because I think we have quite a few IOM colleagues in the room, so this would be very helpful. So just a show of hands, how many people have worked on migration profiles in the past? Oh, surprising, just one. Would you mind maybe perhaps quickly introducing yourself, first of all? And then maybe just giving a 1 to 5 second overview of your experience with the profiles. No pressure.
Yeah, hi. My name's Carl. I'm the head of Migration Health Research and Evidence in IOM. My involvement in migration profiles was when I was a chief medical officer in Sri Lanka. I was heading the health program there, and we did a profile at a country level. Unfortunately, there was very little guidance in the guidance documents around doing migration profiles and doing health profiling at a country level. And so we sort of tinkered a profile of research-related health indicators that came from sort of a systematic review that we did at a country level, and it appeared in the profile. So I think these are extremely useful products, and I think it really sort of keeps the pulse on the different dynamics at a country level. But I suppose the challenge is trying to sort of focus on assisting member states with the health profiling. So that's been my experience at the country level.
Great, thank you. And I'm happy to have your health perspective in the room, because I think, as we'll be sort of discussing today, the migration profiles touch on so many different topics of migration, migration and development topics included, that it's good to have a sort of someone in the room who can speak more to the health aspect of this. But absolutely, you're right that the focus should really be on serving member states, really, and using these as a policy tool. So thanks for that input. Great. So just by way of introduction briefly, my name is Elisa Mosler Vidal, and I work at the GIMDAC office in Berlin of IOM as a research and data officer. So today we'll be speaking about migration profiles as a sort of general policy-making tool, evidence tool, what they're for, how they came about, why they exist. So I'll be speaking a little bit about their structure and the sort of process to set them up. Then we'll go through a few examples of past national level and regional level migration profiles. And then we'll be doing a little bit of a group exercise based on one of the sections of the profiles. So the initial idea behind the migration profiles was actually from the European Commission. So in the 1990s, the European Commission started commissioning these migration profiles, and the idea behind them was to provide a snapshot of migration trends and processes in a country. So as we'll sort of discover today, migration profiles as a whole have developed a lot over the years. And this sort of reflects overall the journey of migration data, migration evidence. Needs have changed, and therefore these profiles have changed. So we'll be speaking a little bit today as sort of about the evolution of this and how this came about. So the first generation of migration profiles, sort of in the 90s, were sort of more targeted. They were written more by external experts on migration. So not so much sort of stakeholders involved in government, perhaps, not so many country-level experts, but these were more sort of external experts who knew about migration, sort of having a very strong theoretical, conceptual framework who then would apply this to specific countries. This has since evolved, and today what we see is more what we call the extended migration profiles. And what this is sort of mainly showed is a shift away from this external sort of expert view of things, and we've shifted more towards a country-owned process for the whole sort of A to Z process of developing a migration profile. So we'll see today more about the stakeholders who are involved in writing all these profiles, but overall, a sort of key change that we've seen in these profiles is that they are more tailored to specific countries. They have more subject matter expertise because they are often now produced by people from within those countries. So what exactly is a migration profile? So the idea behind these documents is that they're a basic tool for migration-related data collection at the country level. So we'll speak a little bit briefly about the overall structure and template of these, but in a nutshell, these represent, firstly, a snapshot of trends, dynamics, statistics about migration in a specific country, and then they explore a little bit more the impacts of migration on development in that country, and vice versa, the impact of development on migration in a particular country. There is also a policy and sort of governance focus to a lot of these profiles. So the idea is also it's a mapping tool at the country level for governments and country stakeholders to be able to pinpoint where exactly there's enough data and evidence on migration at the country level and where there is less data available. So it's a little bit of a diagnostic tool as well in that sense. So the idea is also that because the National Migration Profile and template is to date fairly standardized, we'll see that there is space to customize it, but it does follow a general formula. It does mean that these profiles are also internationally comparable. So we'll see that we've had dozens and dozens produced since the 90s across different countries, and this also allows for a really crucial sort of international level view that means that we can compare different trends and dynamics of migration across different countries. But as Cole also helpfully pointed out, the sort of key aim is also to serve member states, right? Is to serve countries and governments, and for this to not be just another document on stats and figures and numbers on migration in a country, but to actually serve policy needs, program needs of people working on migration in a particular country. So sort of bearing that in mind, another key thing to point out is that it's a sort of key capacity building tool. So we'll see that the process to even develop the profile includes so many stakeholders and has so many validation and review processes with governments in that particular country that it becomes a sort of key capacity building activity over a very long period of time. There's also a key focus on interagency cooperation. So we'll see shortly that we also try to include many different ministries and actors inside and also outside of government in the production of these profiles. And because there is this focus on these being country-owned, because these used to be sort of external and now they are sort of country-owned and sort of internally produced, another key point is that it's really about national ownership and hence about sustainability. So these are not one-off exercises, or at least they are not supposed to be. They're really just the beginning of a process to be able to, for governments to be able to manage their own migration data for policy, migration data for programming. So here is a brief overview of the sort of more standardized template of a national migration profile. Some of you may be familiar with profiles through your own research or sort of a bit more closely than that, but so you may recognize this. Because these are user-friendly sort of documents that we really want people to sort of use in a government sort of policy context, there's usually a 5 to 10 page executive summary, which has sort of key messages on the migration trends in a country. But part A is the more statistical, the more data-driven sort of classic section of the profile. This includes an overview of immigration trends, emigration trends, labor migration, student migration, asylum seekers, refugees. There's a fairly standardized template whereby sort of large migrant groups are given a section of the profile, and using national level as well as international sometimes level data, these sort of trends around these groups are sort of fleshed out a little bit more in this section. This also, as far as possible, gives detail on the drivers of migration. Again, this depends on the national data available, depending on how the censuses or household surveys in that country collect the data on reasons for migration, for example. But this sort of Part A section is meant to be a sort of condensed A to Z, really, of what the data tells us about actual trends and migration dynamics in that country at a particular point in time. Part B of the profiles is more about migration and development. So this is trying to look a little bit past the numbers and looking at what the impact of migration is on development in different sectors of that country and vice versa. So this is very data dependent as well. But the sort of main areas this normally talks about is demographic development, economic development. So there's usually a focus on perhaps remittance flows coming from diaspora members to that particular country. Also maybe diaspora contributions to investment, things like this. There's also a section on labor markets. So this looks at the level of skilled immigration and emigration in that particular country. Excuse me. There's also a section on social development. So this tries to look at the normally fairly patchy data on this sort of section, and it tries to see, well, what are the effects at the societal level of migration? So if we're looking at social cohesion, for example, or other such markers which are normally not quite comparable in between countries, but usually at some point, at some level in that country, there is some data available on this. This is where this is sort of outlined. This also includes a section on health and migration. This is a key one where it's really a sort of bi-directional question, right? So when we think about the impacts of health on migration and migration on health, I think this sector is the sort of maybe one of the easiest ones to elucidate how sort of complex and bi-directional these links can be. So as an example, the health section of the Part B of the profiles often includes sections on emigration of health workers, for example, perhaps on impacts of returned medical professionals to a particular country. It also looks at sort of broader macro level dynamics between mobility flows and health, and also at areas such as healthcare access of immigrants in a particular country. The last section of this, and I should add also one where data usually tends to be very poor, but this is also increasing in importance, is on the environment. So the last section of this, of Part B, tries to look again at the bidirectional impact between climate change and environment and migration. So this is firstly looking at how perhaps environmental changes have affected migration in a particular country, and then also looking at how migration has affected the environment. So an example of this may be urbanization. If we look at a particular country where there's been very rapid rural to urban migration, very often there is some evidence surrounding sort of perhaps the more negative environmental impacts of this on cities, on waste disposal, energy, or sort of coastal erosion that migration may have. So Part C is more sort of about the institutional framework governing migration in a particular country. So what Part C aims to do is sort of give an overview of the skeleton or of the architecture of a particular country and how it governs migration. So firstly, it talks about the policy framework of migration in a country. So this would cover, is there a national migration policy, for example? Is there a national emigration or diaspora policy? Is there a labor migration policy or not? And have there been attempts to establish one? This also talks about laws and regulations. So perhaps looking at, even if a particular country has ratified, for example, the 1951 Convention on Refugees, what are the national level laws that sort of comply to this? So it's looking a little bit more around the legislation behind certain migration governance ideas. Thirdly, this talks about the institutional framework around migration in a country. So is there, for example, an interministerial working group set up to tackle lots of issues, for example, on trafficking? This often tends to be the case. Is there one particular ministry governing migration, or is this, again, as is more often the case, sort of governed by particular different ministries, such as Interior, Labour, etc.? Lastly, this also looks at international cooperation. So this looks at what are the types of engagement that this country has seen vis-a-vis international sort of architecture and institutional arrangements on migration. What is, for example, the state of IOM cooperation in that country, or ILO, UNHCR? So this sort of looks a little bit about how it's engaged with other actors at the international level on migration. Part D of the profile is sort of where all the findings of parts A, B, and C are put together, and it's really about, in a very succinct manner, making these relevant for policy. So what this takes is a sort of overview of all the findings from all the different parts, and then sort of ties this to more salient, more relevant sort of up-to-date policy issues. And it ties these to some tailored recommendations for the country to improve migration data and evidence of policy, given its particular findings. So for example, if in Part B, a certain section of migration development came out as especially relevant or sort of increasing in importance, for example, climate change-driven migration, and if the finding is that there was very little data on this, Part D is where there would be some concrete sort of methods and mechanisms suggested on how to improve data around this sort of issue. Lastly, I'll also add that recommendations very often tend to include sort of more suggestions on how to mainstream migration into development. So considering that 1/3 of the profile is on migration and development, and considering also that many countries tend to have sort of fairly low levels of interministerial sort of collaboration on migration, and overall, given that ministries and different sectors in general have an increasing need to include migration into their sort of parameters of their everyday work, this section also tends normally to include a few suggestions on how to concretely help mainstream migration in different ministries or sectors in that particular country. So this is an overview of the most sort of basic template, the most basic structure of the migration profiles. Many countries sort of adapt this structure a little bit to suit their needs. I'll add that one sort of more common change is really to add a longer section on migration drivers. So many of these profiles have a longer section at the start, talking more about the development context of that particular country. And here some sort of summaries are drawn out of what are the particular migration drivers, or what is suspected to be some of the determinants of migration in that country. But sort of on the whole, most profiles do follow this general structure. So a little bit on the sheer scale of migration profiles. I think this is fairly impressive that over 16, I think now it's at least over 70 IOM migration profiles alone have been developed since the 90s. And I should add that IOM is not the only partner developing migration profiles at all. ICMPD and many other actors also help in the production or even publish profiles sort of on their own. There is a migration profiles repository available, and I think the link is available to you on the extra materials that you have on your USB. And I should add that as a sort of general push that we're seeing towards more regional level migration governance, seen in many sort of international processes such as the SDGs and GCM, we see a lot of talk about regional level governance of many development issues. But applying this to migration as well, I think it's interesting to point out that there's a sort of push now to produce more regional level migration profiles. So as we know, and as we'll see today, migration profiles are a national tool. The idea is that these are for governments, very specific targeted country needs. But I think very healthily, as migration profiles do develop and they sort of do evolve in what they look like, we're seeing more regional level ones being commissioned. So there have been a few, for example, one in Latin America a few years ago. There's one on the Black Sea, and very shortly there'll be one on ECOWAS countries to be released. And I think this is a key thing to point out as well, because it does show that the national migration profile sort of structure is fairly flexible, and we see it adapt in turn to these sort of new policy needs at the regional level. So why might a migration profile be useful? We've talked a little bit very sort of theoretically about how it's good for evidence, how it's good for capacity building, but it's good to sort of get into these questions and see what it actually means in practice. So the main sort of the lowest common denominator really of most of the profiles is that they help develop a common understanding and awareness of migration trends in a country using actually national level data where available, and if not, international level data. So if we look at the different sections in the Part A section, for example, on immigration, emigration, refugees, etc., it's sort of a very, very comprehensive look within a country's data architecture for migration. So the aim is not to plug in gaps with different data if it's not available. The aim is also to point out where data may not be available for a particular migrant group or dynamic. So it's very much a sort of mapping sort of exercise. And in that way, it gathers information on trends and dynamics, but it also really helps governments have a very clear action plan on how to improve data on migration at the national level. So we've spoken a little bit about how all the different sort of sections of the migration profile, and a key thing to point out is that no other tool or document on migration, governance or migration on a country brings these aspects of migration data together. So many countries have very impressive data on, for example, trends, very impressive data on dynamics and different stats on migration. But, for example, these aren't explored in the context of development normally, or in the context of governance in turn. So a key thing to point out here is that actually migration profiles allow for a sort of 360 A to Z look at all of these different topics all together, which is not very often the case. So even if a country is particularly advanced in having a lot of evidence on migration, it's normally not analyzed next to all these other topics. So who actually uses migration profiles? This is really the key question. And I think it's interesting because the answer to this question probably has changed a lot since the 90s as well, which is probably a good thing. But first and foremost, really, the aim is for governments and policymakers at the national level to use these profiles. So this means not only those working directly in migration issues, but also those working in other sectors who are interested in migration. So particularly if we look at the development section and all the different areas that are covered, we see that it's very, very possible, and indeed we would hope, that a health professional or that somebody working in environment in a particular country can pick up a profile and see how migration is relevant to that particular area, and actually what they should be looking for, what data they can try and sort of get more information on their own, and policy focuses for these areas as well that maybe they should be looking at increasingly. Experts and researchers, local and international, because this is such a comprehensive look at a particular country's migration sort of trends. Many researchers from different areas will have an interest in looking at these, particularly as well because it serves as a further resource to consult other materials. Population and mass media. So I mentioned at the start that a really key focus a lot of these profiles is to have a sort of readable exec summary, and for these not to be forgotten policy documents that are never used. So the idea behind this is also to have non-specialists, non-technical specialists also be able to make use of these profiles. Finally, international partners, international organizations and donors also have a key interest in these because it's sort of a heat map of what's going on across so many areas of migration in a particular country. It's also possible to sort of see what a policy focus should be, or where there's a need for a particular area of programming or policy making to increase in a country. So I mentioned that these users have changed over the years, and I think that's also a sort of key point. So I think at the start the idea was that more technical level specialists would be using these documents, and hence the sort of initial focus on having external experts sort of also almost be parachuted in to produce these documents. But as we've seen these be more sort of country-owned and tailored now, there's also simultaneously, I would say, been a focus on making these more usable, on making these more sort of a document that you can pick up, not need to read through the beginning and end of it, but sort of see what's available and interesting to you and take it further yourself. So here are just a few examples of how migration profiles can be used concretely. This is more tailored towards policymakers. So, for example, as migration patterns of, for example, immigration are identified in a country, these can be pretty concretely linked to policy based just on some summary statistics in a migration profile the policymakers may not have seen in the same aggregate fashion until then. So, for example, if a country has an increasing number of citizens coming from a particular country, these sorts of trends are elucidated in a migration profile. So because they're intended to be a snapshot of that year, but they also sort of produce data on trends in the last 5, 10, 20 years in a country, they sort of allow for analysis and comparative analysis that may not be readily available to a lot of policymakers. Another sort of key policy area that may be identified is a particular labour migrant group emigrating from this country. So because most of these profiles try to identify immigrants by skill level and by labour market area and also by destination country, they can also help policymakers see, sort of track these labour migration trends and create policies accordingly. Another key area where migration profiles sort of have a value add for policymakers is that because they use statistical national data as well as administrative national data, they allow for different sort of time series analysis and sort of comparative analysis. So if we look at a lot of administrative level data of a country, it's normally unlikely that a lot of that administrative data is looked at through a migration lens at the country level. So while there may be some data available, if you really look for it on how many sort of work permits there may be in a particular sector, often the data just isn't presented that way over a series of time in a comparable fashion in that country. So for policymakers, it can actually be sort of very useful to see things like administrative data, work permits being the sort of key example here, and see how these change over time in a way that's comparable for them. And lastly, because they are so based on concrete solutions and patching up concrete data gaps, migration profiles can also sort of identify priorities for policymakers on when they need to improve data collection. I should add also data analysis or management. Sometimes the profiles may conclude that while there may indeed be enough raw data collected on a particular dynamic or phenomenon, there actually is very little analysis or management of this data, right? Which is, I mean, as important as data collection, really. So policymakers may not always be aware of these issues, so it also provides a sort of key resource for them, not only to perhaps expand data collection, but also to see where to invest or where to improve data management or analysis in particular areas. Lastly, and a salient point in the context of the SDGs and the GCM, because of the section on the development impacts of migration and vice versa, more policymakers than ever will have an interest in seeing what is the data available on the links between sustainable development and migration in a country. I should add that this Part B section of the profiles is usually the patchiest on data. As we know, a lot of these links are very, very hard to quantify. I'll say out of experience that a lot of these sections on development include many, many tables and graphs on remittance inflows and not much else. So we're sort of seeing a move, a sort of shift and also donor interest, I should add, towards being able to quantify more concretely and also beyond topics such as remittances, being able to quantify the migration and development links. So I think this section is one that, even though it has been included in the profile since the sort of 1990s, it's one that's becoming more and more important because it's really the section that goes past numbers. It's really one that can be mapped very concretely to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's really one that where interest will only increase, both at a sort of national and international level. So just to say a few words on the data capacity building sort of potential of the migration profiles. Apart from how to improve evidence and data on migration, which I think we've spoken enough about, another key thing to point out is that the actual institutional mechanisms behind the production of migration profile in themselves, these mechanisms often have key capacity building sort of effects. So normally there is a technical working group established to manage the process of the migration profile. So what this includes is normally representatives from different ministries. So there's a really big focus on inter-agency, inter-ministerial collaboration behind the production of these profiles. And these set up coordination mechanisms between the ministries, and also at different levels. So I should add that while these are mostly focusing on horizontal collaboration between ministries on migration, it can also help foster vertical collaboration and coherence between migration stakeholders. So while a migration profile is being produced, as data is asked for from different ministries, those ministries may also have to consult down their lines into their local level sort of representatives what data is available. So if we look at the national statistical offices, they usually have fairly clear aggregate sort of snapshots of their own data. But if we look at other ministries who are involved, for example, health ministries or those involved in environment or climate change or indeed labour, very often their data is not vertically fed up as efficiently, perhaps. So it also sort of helps trigger a conversation not only across ministries, but also within ministries vertically on how to improve migration data within these. So very briefly on how to concretely help develop a migration profile. So again, I should add, this process varies across countries. There are different challenges, contexts, opportunities in different countries, but this is the sort of standard suggested set of steps towards developing a profile. So firstly, as I mentioned, a technical working group or a task force is established towards this. Sometimes this is built from scratch, sort of from different ministries. In other instances, perhaps an existing task force or working group may be adapted. So if, for example, there's already some interministerial coordination mechanism set up, for example, for trafficking or for a particular labour migration area, often these sorts of working groups then adapted, the membership may be expanded or modified to fit the needs of the migration profile. The key objectives and the content of the migration profile are agreed on. More often than not, the working group has a very sort of hands-on approach to the section and approves the outline and also approves the main data sources and is very involved from the outset of looking at how it's actually going to be produced. A template for data collection, data gathering is developed. These sort of vary across countries depending on the different ministries involved and also the scale of the different countries. But again, this is sort of a data mapping template really, which can be used across ministries by the team producing the profile to very comprehensively see what's there and what's not there. The next steps are self-explanatory, the data is gathered, consistency is verified. It's a very, very close process between the team of consultants or other staff working on the profile and the working group, and also technical level staff in each of the ministries. Again, I should add at different levels. The first draft is sort of presented normally at the working group or the task force that's been set up, and these may have specific additions or sort of usually fairly engaged working groups do have, it's a sort of very close process between the two teams, and through sort of several evolutions of the draft, a final one is then approved. I should add that apart from generally engaging on different drafts and templates and sort of documents that are involved in the profile development, a lot of these meetings also actually include trainings on the importance of a migration profile. So in the setup of the task force or the working group, depending on their level of engagement on migration to date, the profile production may also include some capacity building activities or trainings with them to kind of underline the importance of the profile, why it matters, contextualize it, and to kind of sensitize really people across ministries and levels on the importance of it to ensure buy-in. And I'll add just as a final point, once the sort of final draft of the migration profile is agreed on, once there have been enough to and fro between the ministries and the working group and the migration profile production team, another key aim really of the whole process is to keep the existing task force or technical working group or whichever body has been set up to manage the process, to keep this body alive or sort of active in some way in some time period intervals after the migration profile. So because for many countries it's the first time that so many different ministries have come together to talk about migration data and evidence and policy, a key aim is also to let these bodies, to keep them engaged. So there's a push in some countries to have migration profiles updated, which we'll discuss shortly, and to sort of keep these as living documents that are updated at sort of, for example, 5 or 10 or realistically slightly more years perhaps. But beyond the production of actual migration profiles and sort of within this context, there's generally a push to keep these bodies alive, to talk about other migration policy issues and governance issues as they may arise. So I'll very briefly talk about a recent example of migration profile refresh, which was quite an interesting case study. So the first migration profile in Ghana was produced in 2009. And this identified a few key data gaps, which I won't go into all of these, but for example, there was not a lot of data on migration characteristics. So if we talked about the socioeconomic profiles of migrants, for example, there was not a lot of data available. Similarly, irregular migration, there was not a lot of data available on their profiles, trends, and dynamics of these. And generally, there was limited coordination and data sharing across institutions and ministries that engage on migration issues. The recommendations in this first migration profile spoke to these data gaps and these policy issues, and had a few sort of series of concrete solutions to this end. The results of the national migration of the profile in the Ghanaian level actually were fairly impressive. So the national migration policy of Ghana was adopted in April 2015. I should add, obviously, this was not a direct, it was not pushed through solely because of the national migration profile in any way. But the national profile was sort of seen in retrospect as a sort of trigger towards many of the conversations that led to the national migration policy being sort of set up. It also brought together lots of government officials and ministries that had pre-2009 not really been speaking about these issues together. In this way, this sort of paved the way for the kind of interagency dialogue which is really key to national migration governance. A National Commission on Migration was also set up in the years after, again, not as a direct sole output of the profile in any way, but again, as a sort of indirect result of these sort of dialogues that took place at the national level. A few other policy outputs, such as the Integrated Migration Management Project and approach. But as a whole, the Ghanaian example, which I'm happy to go into more detail shortly, is a sort of key example of how the National Statistical Office and other ministries were able to hold on to certain migration data solutions and recommendations and really make something very concretely interministerial and very concretely valuable as a result of this. In the last year or so, there's been an update of the National Migration Profile for Ghana. So IOM has been involved with a national consultant there in the production of an updated National Migration Profile. This is still under development, so I can't share the outputs with you. But the aim as well is, because it's been such a valuable exercise for so many stakeholders in Ghana, the aim of this other profile is also to build on the success of the first one and see really where has not only there been an improvement in migration governance, but really sort of going behind this, what does implementation look like of a lot of these data recommendations? Has it been as good in practice as it has been on paper? Sort of these sorts of questions. I should add that the national migration policy also focused on quite a few specific areas of migration governance that were recognized as key in the migration profile. So overall, we've seen that migration profiles are really just the start of a process of migration governance for a country. They are a very useful document, but it's much, much more than just one document. It's really about bringing stakeholders together. It's about starting policy conversations that would not have taken place otherwise. In one word, sustainability is really the key towards all of these efforts. So if we look at the sort of efforts that usually go into establishing a task force or a working group, this is a key condition to success of the migration profile and of this really having an impact beyond just the production of the document. I mentioned earlier that there's been a push for profiles to be updated more regularly. The so-called trend analysis is a really key component of this, and it really just makes it all the more relevant for policymakers to use on an ongoing basis. Because also the user-friendly format has been emphasized in recent years, the aim is also to expand the use of migration profiles past just policymakers and also have academia, journalists, and others be more engaged also in the outputs of a particular migration profile. The aim overall is to obviously hand over the migration profile and the sort of architecture behind it back to government. So again, reflecting the shift that the migration policy profiles saw since the 90s towards an external expert producing these towards a sort of more country-owned process, this reflects really that sort of aim. So at the end of a migration profile, the product as well as the architecture behind it is very much handed over back to the government of that particular country. I'll pause very briefly for questions, but what I also just want to mention is that we're going to do a condensed sort of exercise to hear more on your side what this could mean for you and what sort of you made of certain sections of the migration profile. Very shortly, I'll be speaking a little bit more about part B of the profile, which is on development. Recognizing that I think today, yesterday, and Monday, you've heard a lot about national level censuses and surveys and other statistical and admin data on migration. To sort of get beyond these figures, I thought it would be productive today to focus more on the big question, which is the development and migration question, to sort of get behind the sort of key issues behind this and talk a little bit more about data sources in particular areas and countries that could help us understand trends in this section. But before I move into this and before we get more interactive, I'd like to pause for questions to see if there are any comments or thoughts or questions on what's been covered until now. Please. And if you could please stand and state your name and affiliation, that would be really helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Carolina, and I work with IOM in Turkey. I have some questions. Maybe you already touched base and discussed some of them, but the first one would be how long does it take, in general, to produce such profile? And this is followed by, you mentioned that you have to be working with different national stakeholders and partners, ministries. Do you have any lessons learned about the challenges that you face? Because I'm sure that there are some partners that might not be as supportive as others. And then for the example of Ghana, we saw that there was an update almost after 8-9 years. What would you suggest is the regular time to update a profile? And lastly, do you consider these profiles are only useful in stable country contexts? Because like from the experience of more emergency countries, for example in Turkey, I don't think such a country profile could stay valuable for more than 1 or 2 years. So my question is, would it make sense to develop one, even if maybe after 1 year the situation is completely different? Thanks.
Thank you. Please.
Some of the question has been already addressed by Carolina. Thank you. I have additional question. So, in case Natsuko from IOM Morocco, in case of Morocco, we have already interministerial coordination mechanism led by a Ministry of Migration. And what is your advice on using existing institution? That number one. And then second question is how to integrate existing surveys done by National Statistic Agency. This year they are launching HIMSS, household survey, but focused on migration, immigration, and emigration. So how do you incorporate those existing and not to create double duplicate study? And also link with MGI, for the part C. I think many questions are already covered by MGI, which Morocco has been part of it. And the third and final question would be, who take the lead of this process? If the migration profile aims at ownership and sustainability, I guess that it's a national institutional entity who takes the lead of the file, and not IOM or external expert, but what were the challenges?
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions? Thanks very much. I'll respond to them in order then, but firstly, thank you very much. These are all really relevant questions. Firstly, Carolina, thanks for your questions. In terms of how long it takes, it really depends on the country context. So this can take anywhere from 6 or 9 months as a sort of, I would say, bare minimum, to quite a lot over 1 year. And I think this depends mostly on if the institutional mechanism already exists, if it needs to be adapted, or if it's done from scratch. Another key factor affecting time is really just their engagement, to be honest. So government buy-in, how much training or sensitization, if any, is needed before the process is really started. And then thirdly, obviously, what happens in that time. So are there any key political changes in that country, which also goes to your other point on stability, which I'll address in a second, but really sort of how fast is the engagement between sort of various drafts of the document and the working group. But I would say 9 months at the sort of most efficient, flexible of scenarios is realistic, but it can take a lot longer. In terms of challenges with engaging with some government stakeholders, I think this is a really key point, and I think I mentioned very briefly that capacity building or trainings were also very key at the beginning, and I would really emphasize that it's not only about delivering a random generic presentation on profiles if this is to take place, it's more about taking, be it a few weeks or months at the start of a program, to really sort of almost pinpoint what would be necessary to make it relevant to that country. So not only presenting on very theoretically what's the point of a profile, but really working with people already at the country level who aren't necessarily involved in the profiles to tailor really what are the policy objectives in migration of that country, what parts of the profile, if it's to be produced, would help those policy objectives. So I would really emphasize that a tailored and much more hands-on approach at the start of the project is really the answer to a lot of the challenges, which tend to be lack of buy-in, really. The other challenges I sort of mentioned in terms of how long it could take, these processes, because they are interministerial, can just take a lot of coordination. This just takes a lot of time, especially because even within one ministry, if there is a capacity building or training sort of series of activities taking place, more often than not, only a few representatives of that ministry are present in these sessions, which means that not everybody who will be involved practically at the technical level will be as brought into the process. So something that I would add also is there's a key importance, which is often overlooked also because of resource needs and timelines, to involve at the local level, perhaps also people in different ministries or institutions, to involve them in the sort of initial stages of the process. So that can also sort of help speed things along and sort of get more buy-in, which improves chances of success. In terms of what's a good time to refresh the profiles, you asked, sort of, you're right, so the Ghana example was just sort of under 10 years. I would say it's also about being realistic because they take such a long time to be updated. Something under 5 years would probably A, not be realistic, or B, be that helpful perhaps because the actual sort of trends reflected may already be outdated by the time it's published, depending on the country context. I would say, to be honest, depending on the context, something like 10 years would actually be an ideal scenario. There are also options to update parts of it in the interim. So if there is one section, for example, on development on environment and migration, there's a particular interest in the country level in that topic, it's possible to then produce interim updates on that every 3 or 5 years. So the emphasis is also that these are tools that are really meant to be useful so they can be adapted. It's not like this needs to be a 2-year process that takes place every 10 years. It's more about, okay, should we update one particular section every 3 years? Is that realistic? Then let's run with that. So I would say it really sort of depends on the country. You asked also about stability. What is the use of, or is there a use of, and how to make these profiles useful in a rapidly evolving context, maybe less stable context? I think that's actually a really key question because I mean, it's a big undertaking, right, to produce these profiles. It's not something that can be done with one consultant in 1 month at low resource. It requires a lot of buy-in. It's important for whoever's sort of undertaking the process to see that it'll be valuable. What I would say is that in ever-changing contexts, definitely it's especially valuable because what the migration profile shows in those contexts, which is valuable, is where the data sources are. And those are perhaps unlikely to change even as a particular migration trend or phenomenon changes in that country. So I'm thinking, for example, a country like Niger, which has recently had its profile updated. Obviously, the sort of conditions and the context in Niger has changed wildly in the last sort of few years in terms of migration. And at least from what I've seen of the latest migration profile on this, it's less perhaps about the data available on this, for example, on irregular migration flows or on internal migration, but it's more about mapping what the sources are. And those are unlikely to change drastically, I would say, even if there's a sort of emergency context, because if they're national level sources and data collection, it's still possible to say where the data is, which is very useful for policymakers. I think the answer there would also be to make it as flexible as possible, right? So to not invest loads of resources in a 2-year exercise, but maybe to focus on particular sections. But the data mapping context, the data mapping element, I would say, is what makes it still valuable. But certainly it would be a sort of what's more useful. Is it a condensed version of this? It would be a conversation of how to make it more relevant. Natsuko, thanks. You asked about existing institutions and how to make these sort of, how to adapt these, how to set these up. I would say the key is really also to make this relevant to migration objectives in that particular country. So I spoke about the capacity building or training kickoff activities that can be included. And I would say that's actually a key part of whichever body is set up to lead the process. A key part of establishing this is to make sure that there's appropriate training or capacity building on this. So I mentioned the example of trafficking earlier just because more often than not, many countries have a task force which includes different agencies on trafficking already. But it's an example of where maybe sort of interior ministries or security or policy, police, and also labor ministries are involved, and health as well. But in that particular context, it would be about mapping. Would there be then a need to include more representatives on climate change or environmental experts in there? But I would say that it's more about, first of all, mapping what's the delta between an existing body and what's needed, and then really training and capacity building and sensitization plugs that gap really of ensuring that the others are on board. You mentioned surveys and what's, perhaps if I understood correctly, what's really the value add of this sort of exercise, if there's already, for example, an IPMS project on, or if the microdata of a census is already available, and I think that's a good question. I would say the value add is really that the different sections on trends, development, and governance, the different sections are brought together in a profile in a way that a wonderful IPMS report does not sort of put all these data points together. So I think if a country already has this census microdata, for example, available, which is fantastic, that should make part A on trends, for example, even stronger, which is a great thing. And then parts B and C would really be about using also that data to go further to see what areas of socioeconomic profiles of migrants, how they differ, what can be improved using exactly this data. So I would say it's not about replacing it at all. It actually, if there's already strong data collection or analysis in one area, it's actually an impetus to make the profile even more valuable. Overlap with the MGI, thanks for the question. So for non-IOM colleagues in the room, the MGI is a tool that IOM has developed called the Migration Governance Indicators. Many of you will be familiar with this, and I think there was a session on this yesterday. And this is a sort of tool which has over 90 questions on migration governance inputs in a particular country. So what this does is it asks governments what arrangements are in place, what policies are in place to manage migration. The emphasis also being they are input questions. So it's not really about the impact of a particular policy, but it's more about, does the policy exist? The migration governance part C of the profiles has a lot of overlap with MGI, you're right. I would say, again, similar to my answer on IPUMs, the MGI should really be seen as a tool to help produce a high quality part C of a migration profile because the data are already there, and actually at a very granular level it's possible to get very good data on this. But because the MGI tool, as valuable as it is, it measures inputs, I think the value add of a migration profile would be that it can actually go a little bit beyond this, and in the impacts of migration and then in the policy implication section can sort of go a little bit further and use even the MGI results to go a little bit beyond this and look at the impacts of migration governance at the country level. So again, a country may have stellar data collection in one area, but this should never replace a profile, but actually should just strengthen it, I think. Finally, you asked who leads the process. The answer would be whichever body is set up at the country level to do this. So if there was a task force or a technical working group set up, the idea is that they are not sort of left latent and to sort of dissolve after the process, but that they can very much take the lead on refreshing your profile or on perhaps tracking the recommendations afterwards. But you're right, this should not be an IOM-owned process at all. The idea is that the countries then take this into their own hands.
Thanks. Lorenza Rossi from the regional office in Cairo, the DTM coordinator. So yes, a bit of overlapping, or what are the difference between the different products? For example, this World Migration Report that is also done by IOM, it's done every 2 years. That's more on statistics and trends and reasons and flows, but it doesn't have the part on migration governance. But that's updated every 2 years. Then there is the situation report, which is also a regional product that it's pretty much the same, and it's published also more frequently. And then you're suggesting that there is maybe a demand or possibility to do these migration profiles at regional level. Would this still be every 10 years? I mean, 10 years, when you said 10 years, it seemed kind of a long, it's a long, big gap between one and the other. So, I mean, this is more of a comment for discussion. It's not like, what is it really useful, for example, at regional level? These migration profiles updated every 10 years. When I was looking at them for countries where we don't have data except for UN DASA data, these migration profiles are pretty old, and so maybe big trends don't change, but figures change, policies gets updated, a lot happens in 10 years, so they were not really useful for me to understand what was the situation, and I was looking more at the World Migration Report, because at least that, I mean, yes, it's still UN DASA figure, but at least it's updated every 2 years, and yeah, I mean, it's not a question, it's more like a discussion on where we should go with all these products and what is useful at what level and what frequency to keep us updated.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. Certainly, I think if you look at all the IOM products alone, let alone from other agencies, questions about overlap do arise, and really what's the utility of each of these. Just to respond to a few of your comments, I think, again, the data mapping element of the profile is really the key. So I understand that if you're looking at more operational data and sort of trends, migration profiles aren't the most up-to-date source, and I understand that DESA data, WMR, are more useful. What I would say is that migration profiles are more of a springboard almost into deeper sort of looking at what's available on a country level. But yeah, it's not a timely sort of snapshot of data at the country level in that sense. It's more of a, where do I go from here? In terms of the intervals, I mean, the 10-year interval is sort of, in the case of Ghana as an example, it was what was realistic because it also reflected sufficient changes in governance in between the production of both profiles. Again, agreed that the purpose of this then is different. It's not that you can then consult this as a sort of newsworthy item. It's more about, in 5 years, many countries don't actually see a lot of changes in their migration governance, firstly, and also in their migration data collection. So if we're looking at the mapping utility of a profile, it's unlikely that a census has changed wildly, in the last 5 years, because often there's also no new data. So it's more about reflecting those processes. But yeah, I mean, I think you bring up an important point about the utility of these sorts of things, and I think it's not a sort of timely snapshot of trends. It's more of a, I'm really interested in this country. Where can I take it further? Yeah. Please, Cole, you have a comment?
Yeah, just before a comment, I think for IOM colleagues to realise these are, as you mentioned correctly, these are catalytic documents. It is for not only the member state but also the UN country team to garner a strategy around migration. These instruments are not meant to be statistically robust analytical pieces that one looks at. It is trend analyses, it's scoping where the gaps are within the landscape. It's a mapping, and I think the process is, more powerful, especially in the developing Global South context, because it really is a powerful tool to galvanize various actors around a migration governance. So I think these have been very useful, especially in countries, in low to middle income countries, because it actually starts the conversation. And to use it as a reference guide, I mean, it's a springboard to looking more at deeper data sets, right? So, but it's a conduit. It's not a sort of a master data set. And I think having been part of this, it really has actually prompted policy trajectories. Like, for example, in the Sri Lankan context, there was an evolution in developing a national migration health policy, for example, as a result of the kind of gaps in data. So I think it's how you use it as a tool, and I really believe that this really it goes to the core of our technical cooperation with member states. And without the profile, we can't have a country strategy or do you know what I mean? Like it becomes a useful tool.
But then when we expand the regional level, how do you see? Because then what is that? I mean, ECOWAS is
Okay.
one thing. There is a unit.
Yeah.
There is a
Body, yeah.
Yeah.
that exists now. Middle East,
Yes.
North Africa.
Yes.
It's not one region. It's three
Yes.
regions for IOM.
Yeah.
Basically, it's GCC, North Africa, and
Yeah.
and the Middle East. Which are the regions? Well, who are the body that will be in charge? So
I think that sort of the IOM RCPs, the regional cooperation processes, I know, for example, in Asia Pacific, the Colombo process countries have really promoted member states within the Colombo process, which are labor sending countries, to please encourage your member states to do these migration profiles, because not everybody has done that. And it's a really useful, as I mentioned, at a regional level, through our regional governance mechanisms, regional reports could manifest based on thematic areas, for example, like in the case of Colombo process, labor sending. And there's the Abu Dhabi dialogue too on the receiving country. And so I think, once again, I think these are useful platforms to catalyze policy, debate and governance around migration. But I certainly think that, as you correctly mentioned, you really have to calibrate what the situation of a country is if there is a really powerful body within government who is taking the lead on this, then it's easier to piggyback on that process and then encourage the creation of a profile if it hasn't happened in that country. So it really is up to the technical persons and chiefs of missions to really catalyze this sort of thing. Yeah.
So these RCPs could be like a platform or a conduit to start discussing the possibility of having one of these.
Correct, yeah. And I think in the case of the Middle East, it is more complicated than others, you're right, because I think the ECOWAS example, the body is there, you're right. I think it's just a case of tailoring it to the context, right, and seeing if perhaps there can be sub-regional elements to it and then one regional one, for example, might be an option. I think Marwa had a comment.
It's actually nothing much to add to what you've already said, but I just want to build on what Cole said. It's really a catalytic document because we just started trying to draft something like a migration profile in Egypt, and as you mentioned, it really is a capacity building tool, and we started to identify the gaps. For instance, the part on health and migration, I'm quite sure there's data somewhere in Egypt, but we just couldn't get it to this point. So which means that we need to go a step further beyond dealing only with the main counterpart, the CAPMAS as the National Statistical Office, and maybe try to go to Ministry of Health and go on a more local level and see what kind of data are being collected, why they are not reflected in national reports. Does that mean that there's some sort of communication coordination gap that the government should pay attention to? Also, it just rings a lot with what Cole has mentioned in his presentation about what kind of services that migrants can have access to when it comes to health. So yeah, as far as I know, for the migration profile, at least on the country level, it is indeed a very good capacity building tool. I fully agree with that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, thanks all for your comments. And I think it's interesting to hear from IOM colleagues who have been involved with them or who will shortly be involved with them, that it's more about, Cole used the word catalytic, and it's true. It's more about the processes that it kicks off rather than the actual, the graphs on labour migration will not change policy in that moment in time when it's published. It's more about what went into that, what does it mean in the next few years for that particular country. So I think because we started about 20 minutes late, we're sort of going to have to wrap up in a few minutes. But what I'll do is I'll give some handouts at the end so that you can take away with you. But what I wanted to do was do a sort of short 15-minute exercise on part B of the profile. And instead I'll just sort of run through some common data sources for migration and development, and then perhaps hear from you if anybody has some wrap-up comments on their reactions to this or any thoughts. That would be very welcome. As mentioned, we're focusing very briefly on this section because the migration trends and stats are something that you probably know much more about. You've heard a lot about it this week, so I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about these linkages, which are in practice a lot more elusive, really, at the policy level. I hope you can read the text, but so demography, economic development, and labour markets are sort of three key areas that the profiles go into detail on migration's impacts. So I'll just take one example, which is on economic development. So I mentioned at the start that very often, because this depends so much on the data availability in a particular country, when we think about economic development and migration and these bidirectional links, based on the data that's available, many country profiles end up focusing on remittances, which are a key development force of development in many countries. And so because there is very comprehensive international level data on the flows and also very often on the costs or the transfer costs of these particular remittances, this section often sort of elucidates that further. But I wanted to focus here on perhaps how to go further just in the case of economic development, because really the picture is a lot more colourful, a lot richer, a lot deeper than, for example, just remittance flows into a particular country. So just to give a few more examples of how migration can affect economic development in a country and vice versa, I'd like to mention that, for example, immigration, as we know, can impact productivity, demand, internal demand for goods, trade between particular countries, particularly of origin and destination countries, obviously, but also more broadly between regions. There has been shown to be some effect on this. Migration can affect the fiscal balance of a country, particularly where there's high rates of labour immigration in regular labour market sectors in a country. The fiscal balance is very often improved as a result. In many cases, we see labour migrants are younger, are more engaged in labour markets than native populations in some instances. And in these, for example, the net fiscal sort of balance is positive, right? Diaspora contributions to economies via remittances, but also investments, financial transfers, in-kind transfers to households, for example. These are key areas of information on migration and development, which are really, really hard to get data on, right? These are all linkages that we know about, but it's very hard to actually measure these internationally, nationally, regionally. So what a migration profile can do in this context is sort of start to pinpoint areas of suggestions of how data can be collected in these areas. So if we look at, for example, a fiscal balance of a country and how migration can affect it, it's very possible to carry out studies using existing national level data on the fiscal inputs and the fiscal effects of migrants in a particular country. So there have been, for example, quite a few studies on this more in OECD countries using existing national level data, looking at what are, for example, the tax effects of having labour immigrants in particular sectors. And it's sort of data areas such as these which can sort of grow out of a migration profile, which are really, really valuable, in my opinion. Other areas of migration and development which profilers tend to focus on are social development, social cohesion, inclusion. Again, this is very hard to quantify. So more often than not, these sections focus on patchy, qualitative sort of strands of evidence in different regions of a country, not wholly comparable on the whole, but again, very valuable. If we think about issues such as migration and education, access to social protection, there it is possible to get a little bit more sort of quantifiable or quantitative comparable evidence at the country level. When we speak about health of immigration and medical professionals, for example, many countries use international level data from the WHO to talk about these issues, but there are also national level sort of health data sources which can help towards this as well. Finally, on the environment, this is a section where very often migration profiles have very, again, patchy qualitative evidence. Excuse me. Sometimes this talks about the determinants of migration in a particular context. These are very hard to disentangle, as we know, but this is sort of what ends up being in this section. So I think because we did end up running over because we started late, I'll sort of wrap it up here, but I'll distribute the two handouts at the end on part B on development so we can discuss this further. Maybe a quick round of questions if there are any still, but otherwise thanks very much for your engagement.